Okay, so now what we want to do is we want to start with the basic V1 model that we just had up in the last video. And before we do anything else, we want to add a fidelity level. We want to call this the level 1 fidelity. So we're going to say add level, and we're going to call that level 1. And what it does here is it adds an architecture and fidelity level to our list. By default, it's arch 0 because we didn't actually set an architecture name of our own, and it gave us the fidelity level we want. So now we have a model saved, this model in fact, as an architecture and fidelity level that we can always go back to. Okay, so now let's get to the point where we were after the just after the replacement rules. So we're going to do the replacement rules again. I want to replace V1 with V2 and call it V2. And this is where we were at right after the end of the last video. So at this point we want to continue doing some things to change this model into the fully fledged V2 fidelity. So the replacement rules got us part of the way there, got us a start. This is a fully executable model, but maybe we'd like to take some other steps. And those other steps can be encompassed in this other file command here, which is called go to level 2 after the replacement rules. So we're going to edit that file command just to see what it contains. And basically what it's saying to do here is to change our variable values. So the V2F1, instead of coming from the input adapter, we now want to come directly from the UV1 subsystem over here. Same thing for the acceleration that's being consumed by DV1. We want that to come straight from the V2 subsystem instead of the output adapter. And then we don't need the input and output adapters, so we're going to get rid of those. And then the next thing we want to do is just change the subsystem names. The UV1 we want to call it UV2, and DV1 we want to call it DV2. So very, very simple modifications. We could do a lot more, of course, here. We could program this to include calculation changes or further name changes. We could make our UV1 model include all the inputs that we have for V2, so it's all consistently in one place and such. But let's keep it really simple. And we're going to call this, after we finish these steps, the full V2 fidelity, and then we're going to add another fidelity level. So let's just run that file command, and here's our clean V2 fidelity level. So V2 is now consuming its inputs from UV2, and DV2 is taking its inputs from V2 and producing that output acceleration. And V2 stays the same, basically. It's got the same parameters, same inputs. So at this point what we can do is add another fidelity level, and we can call this one level 2. So now we have these two fidelity levels, and we can always go back and forth between them. We can always just load these levels. We can click on it, and I can load it, and I can click on it, and I can load it, and I can go back and forth. The problem with doing that is that these are just statically stored models. So if I were to do some more work now that I'm at level 2, I wouldn't be able to go back to level 1 without losing that work. So that's the problem here. The way we can fix that problem, the way we can still go back and forth between fidelity levels while having done other work on the subsystem, is to invoke this concept of history and history names. So I'm going to show you that. All the while that we've been working here, we've been basically recording the history of everything we've done in the API. All the commands we've invoked are API commands, and every time we invoke one of these commands, basically this gets recorded in our command history. Okay, so everything we've done on the model so far is here. And so what we can do is we can name portions of this history that we'd like to repeat in the future. So the part of the history that we'd like to repeat again is the part that comes after we did the level 1 fidelity, we did the replacement rules, then we changed some variable values, then we deleted 2 subsystems, we changed a couple of subsystem names, and then we added another fidelity level. So basically steps 4 through 10 represent the history that we want to capture here. So in order to do that, we're going to name history, and we're going to say what name we want that to be. We'll call it V1 to V2, and we'll say steps 4 through 10. And we'll say OK to that. Now when I show my history, I see all my steps and I see my history names down below. So I can always use that V1 to V2 history steps by invoking the name and go back to the V1 model. And it wouldn't matter now that I have, and I can do this in reverse if I want to. So I can invoke the history name, I can run history, it'll ask me which one I want to run. If I underscore and say rev, it will run it in reverse. If I run it forward to V2, it'll do it in the forward direction. So if I have, for example, more work done on this model, let's say this is all part of the satellite model, so I'm going to run the file command to build that whole satellite model right now, and there it is. Okay. Let's say I'm working on the satellite model and I want to go back to the previous level of fidelity for the to the V1 model, let's say. Well, I can do that now by running my history to V2 rev. Okay, and it'll basically keep all the work I did on the satellite. And there's my UV1. Well, it's a little bit out of order now, but there's UV1, DV1, and V1. So it allows me to traverse back through those steps, and it doesn't affect anything else. I could also run it in the forward direction, just like I did before. And again, it'll only affect the steps in the API. So that's how I can go back and forth. I can also create fidelity actions that are associated with these two levels. Fidelity actions are just another way of invoking the history name. So I can add an action, and I basically say V1 to V2. That action maps to the history name of the same name, basically. And once I do that, I have associated with this level, this is just a reminder that V1 to V2 starts with this level and ends with this level. I also have associated with level 2 the reverse action, which gets me back to level 1. So if I'm on level 2, as I am right now, I can click on V1 to V2 rev, and I can run the action, and it'll take me back to the V1 model without losing any of my work. If I'm on the V1 model, I can run the V1 to V2 action in the forward direction, and it'll take me to the V2 model. So that's how named history works and how fidelity actions work. They're really the same, just the same concept, same basic functionality.